the rangeland health standards. I mean, it's a fairly minute change on paper maybe that's happening, but it's a big deal. And now those will apply to all multiple uses, not just grazing.
You are 100% right. And I think this is without a doubt the most important part of this regulatory update.
Well, that was Public Lands Council Executive Director Kaitlynn Glover. As today, we're going to be talking with her about several things and some of the big wins that the Public Lands Council has seen with the latest administration and the Bureau of Land Management. One of those, of course, will be talking about the proposed grazing rule update, which they have a comment period coming up here on July 13th, so important deadline on that one. We're also going to be talking about the BLM rescinding the public lands rule, and hey, this year is the International Year of the Rangeland and Pastoralist, so a great conversation with Kaitlynn Glover coming up. We're also going to be talking about some of the major headlines, and we're also going to be talking about some of the major market updates and see where we're looking like on that latest June acreage report. We're going to be talking about some big bills coming out of Washington, D.C. That's all happening here on your Northern Ag Network's Next Year Country podcast. Well, we have to say a big thank you to our sponsor, BNSF, as from America's farms to tables around the world, BNSF Railway keeps agriculture moving. Operating more than 3,200 route miles across North America, BNSF safely and efficiently delivers the products that feed, clothe, and power our communities. In fact, BNSF moves enough grain every year to provide a year's supply of bread for 1 billion people. Backed by 175 years of railroading experience, BNSF is proud to connect America's producers with markets across the nation and around the globe. BNSF Railway, driving agriculture forward. Well, Andy Schwab alongside Coulter Brown and Colton Young here on your Next Year Country podcast. Gentlemen, welcome. What a week this last week was. 4th of July holiday. It was a celebration like no other. I know, Colton, you, as we mentioned last week on the podcast, you were on the board of directors with the Red Lodge Home of Champions Rodeo. Night one got a little wet.
Yeah, we had a little bit of hail. It was actually the first rodeo I've ever been to that I think has happened in Red Lodge that they took a lightning delay. So we got through 2 of the 4 rounds of the Extreme Bulls, and then we had to stop for 40 minutes or so because that hail was coming down pretty hard for a minute, and then, of course, lightning. But after that, it was a pretty smooth week and a lot of excitement in Red Lodge for the 4th of July.
And for the 4th of July for Mr. Coulter Brown and his family, they headed up to the Ride in Roundup, Montana, and took part of the Tanya Tucker concert. Cooper Allen, our very own from KGHL, Mr. Bo Swayze, was able to introduce the bands coming on stage. How did Bo do? Be honest.
Bo did a good job. Bo did a very good job. Even when he got flashed on the stage, he kept his composure. So, old Bo Swayze, he's always there for a good time and did a fabulous job. I'll tell you one thing about Roundup, though. It was a big weekend. I think they had 10,000 people at both concerts. It was a bad time to be a Coors Light there.
Yeah. Did you accept the 250 beers by 250 weekend or whatever it was?
Not personally, or not on my own. It was a group effort. Many of us were taking on the challenge.
Well, myself, last week I was able to attend a concert in Billings. Actually, it was a Charlie Crockett concert. Oh, yeah. I'll be honest, I knew a couple of his songs, didn't really know his music that well, but I knew he was pretty good. And then I go with my buddies and, we're, not as young as Colton is here. And so we took our lawn chairs. We're sitting back in the back and we're just enjoying our cold beer and listening to Charlie. And he's like, hey, I don't know if you guys hear this, but that radio station you have here in town, that KGHL, the Mighty 790, that's one heck of a radio station. I was just cheering like, that's our home flag station. That's our flagship station. It was pretty fun. But
didn't know who he was before. Now he's your favorite artist.
Yeah. We're friends. He's got a new album coming out here in a month, so be sure to take care and watch that as Charlie Crockett. Good concert there, and just a great 4th of July weekend. Did you guys get anything else in while I know you were busy, Colton, with the rodeo, but
that's all I did.
As mentioned, we got a great conversation coming up with Kaitlynn Glover from the Public Lands Council, but first off, we're going to say thank you to Two Gun Apparel. Every great brand has a story, and for Two Gun Western Apparel, they started in Montana as a double-wide trailer and a one-hat press and a dream. Today, founder Cameron Bumgardner and the Two Gun team have proudly produced high-quality custom ranch wear, decorating every cap and garment right in Montana. Now, whether you need custom branded hats, unique Western apparel, or even premium beef tallow mustache wax, Two Gun Apparel has the products and craftsmanship to help your operation stand out. Built by cowboys for cowboys, they're ready to take your brand to the next level. Visit twogunwesternapparel.com today to wear your brand with pride.
Colton, do you want me to call Cam and see if he has some of that mustache wax that you can use?
You know, I trimmed it. It's been down like a year and a half. I don't know if you remember when I first started here. It was out. I had it out a good, good ways.
Doc Holiday.
Then I realized how stupid I looked, so I trimmed it down quite a bit.
Weren't you mad that we didn't tell you how we thought you looked?
Well, I'm just waiting. Once I hit puberty, I'll probably bring it back. It'll come in pretty good.
You're doing better than me.
Colton's always good for a little ribbing, so we appreciate that you allow us to do that. But want to get into some of our news stories, and boy, just a bevy of them here in the last week to talk about. Hard to kind of narrow it all down with all the announcements coming out of Washington. A lot of things that came out right before the 4th. I think the biggest one, though, that I want to touch on today was the long-awaited introduction of House Ag Committee Chairman G.T. Thompson's bill to modernize the H-2A program. That's something across agriculture that we've asked for years, and H-2A has really become a critical source of labor, from fruit picking to dairies, sheep herders, and really any kind of farmer ranch across Montana and Wyoming. You'll find H-2A workers, and there's been huge growth in the program in the last 5 or 6 years. But if you go back to 1996, H-2A visas have increased more than 2,000%. So it's a critical access to labor. It's critical. It's not cheap labor. I think anyone that's uses the program will sure let you know that. But what does this bill do then that's going to try to reform and make it more usable for agriculture? The big thing is it's making H-2A function for year-round agriculture. You know, traditionally it's been seasonal ag workers, but trying to make that function for more operations. It's going to allow workers to remain on the job for up to 350 days, limit federal fees to be in the program, and reform the wage methodology to prevent some of the unpredictable fluctuations. Colton, this was something that we heard a lot about at the Montana Stock Growers Labor Summit in January, so it feels like a big win to see it finally introduced in Congress.
I think this is a huge win, and it's really fun for me to see because this was one of those, you know, we went to that Ag Labor Summit, I guess it was last January when they had that, and to hear some of the producers firsthand talk about their struggles. I know when they talked about it, it was specifically in the livestock auction market, so I'm hoping that whatever the final bill comes through, there is some regulatory change or even just some description changes to help their operations out. But to see the concern in our home state, in our home city in Billings, and now to see it come up on the national level in Washington, D.C., I think it's just awesome to see kind of how the chain worked, because the stock growers did send a letter to the Department of Labor, and I think that's kind of what we're experiencing here now with this bill. So it's just a cool overall process. I'm excited to see it brought up. As you mentioned, it's just been a challenge for every sector of the ag industry for many, many years.
Well, and a big deal to separate this from immigration reform, which is something that's also needed, don't get me wrong, but that's a separate issue, one that becomes much more divisive. But I think agriculture needs this. We need an H-2A program that'll work for all operations. I mean, there at the Labor Summit, we heard from producers talking about going to the effort, paying the money to get H-2A workers here, and then they abscond in the middle of the night to another job, and you're out the cost, and now you don't have any help. So hopefully this will make that program more usable. Andy, I know you talked to Turk Stovall here recently, and labor has been a key part of their producer profitability initiative.
He was actually in Washington, D.C. when House Ag Committee Chairman G.T. Thompson put this out, and he said that they were on a phone call with him as it was getting developed, and he said that he just vividly remembers during one of those producer profitability listening sessions that one producer stood up and said, if I didn't have this, I wouldn't have a business. If I didn't have H-2A, I couldn't continue in the ag industry. So he said it just stuck out to him vividly, and just really appreciated the collaboration that they're getting from Washington, D.C. on this and other things that are coming out of Washington, D.C.
Well, getting the bill introduced is only half the battle. You got to get it passed and across the president's desk, but certainly a positive step for farmers and ranchers across the West, across the country. But another program wanted to talk about, again, announced there in Washington, D.C. I'm sure Turk Stovall is intimately familiar with this, but it's called the SPUR program, and it'd provide $500 million in payments to small U.S.-owned beef processors. So the idea behind it is it's meant to help plants that are, of course, paying record prices to purchase cattle right now. So and those smaller plants especially, and it ensures that ranchers have access to that direct-to-consumer market that obviously we depend on those plants. A couple of details: they have to be federally or state-inspected plants under the CIS program. They've got to be U.S. owned, so that's a critical portion portion, but I think the biggest thing is they cannot be considered nationally dominant. And how they're measuring that is they can't be one of the big four packers, basically. So it seems like a positive deal, but I'm kind of thinking, well, what does this mean? And what is it going to do for our industry? Does it mean we're going to have more small plants across the country? Do we just maintain the plants that we have and keep them going? Does this help the more medium-sized plants get bigger to have access to these funds? I think it's a lot of questions. And, you might say, well, this is the government taking a larger role in the marketplace. I don't know. Curious how you guys are reading this.
Honestly, I hate to be this guy, but $500 million doesn't do a whole lot, it seems like, anymore nowadays when you start spreading it across the entire country. There's a lot of small and medium-sized packers across the entire nation, but it is a really good start, like you mentioned. And Dirk Stovall, right there in the USDA's office, sitting 3 chairs down from the U.S. Ag Secretary during the announcement of the SPUR program. And he said there was producers in there was meat packers in there was all walks of life. It was also something that was kind of garnered from that Common Ground Summit that they recently had. And it was just good to see that the administration is putting what they are bringing to them into action. He said the previous administration, you could tell them what you want, you could tell them what you're hearing from the producers, and they might listen to you, but do they put it in an action item? Not really. But this administration, he said, is just amazing how well and how quick they're listening and putting things into actionable items.
I agree. They listen very quick. Because if you recall back to last week in our podcast, I said that we are seeing a lot of the government start to kind of shift and try to support the independent small packers. So I think Rollins just heard me talking on the podcast and decided, you know what, let's get the program out there. He was right. I think it's exciting to see. And like you mentioned, the $500 million might not go a long ways, but I think it's super optimistic because, as we mentioned, this is specifically not for the big four. And we're seeing what kind of margins they're paying right now. We're seeing a lot of the plants start to either go to reduced schedules or even close down. So is this an opportunity for those plants that have less overhead? Of course, less overhead means less profitability when it does turn around, but is this that opportunity for them to just kind of get one step ahead, try to narrow that gap from the big four to the medium size and even all the way down to the small processing plants that we see in our neck of the woods here?
Be interesting to see what it does. I mean, today there are more small packing plants in the country than there were 20 years ago. And that's a result of COVID, when, again, the government stepped into the market, put a lot of money towards supporting these small plants. And we saw a ton of them pop up across the region here, which is a good thing. At that point, right at the start of COVID, you were 18 months out to get an animal processed. And so now we have more availability, but it's a challenging business to be in. And, we've even seen since that time frame some plants open and close because there's a lot of factors in it. Scale is a big issue. We all think we'd rather have local beef. We'd rather have a steak that was raised locally and support the local economy. But it's a challenge to do, especially to get it at scale into some of these grocery stores and figure out the distribution of that. What do you do with the hide and offal? A lot of the big plants, they'll survive on the drop credit. Yeah. But smaller plants are paying to get rid of it. So it's an issue for them. But I mean, I think this support hopefully keep those businesses going through what I'm sure is a challenging time in the small meat packing business with these record high prices. But very interesting to see it come about.
I'm curious, what message do you think this is sending to the big four? Obviously, where they're not, domestically owned in the United States, they could care less in a way of what the U.S. government is doing. But what is their thought process going to be seeing this? Do you think they're bothered by it, or are they just not going to worry about it?
Well, I can only speculate wildly on how the big packers would interpret that, but I think that they know that the Trump administration is not going to be their friend.
Yeah.
I mean, the administration has already come out and said, we're going to target consolidation in agriculture, and they are actively investigating the packers. So I think it's a little bit keeping them on notice. I mean, we need the big packers. Do not get me wrong. It takes that level of scale to make this industry function, but the Trump administration is not going to go out of their way to support them in this.
Yep.
Well, those are just a couple of the headlines that we've covered here recently. There's a lot more we could talk about, from efforts to increase fertilizer capacity to reducing duties on phosphate fertilizer to some crop protection companies asking for duties on glyphosate. So a lot of things we could cover, but we also have a fun interview to share with you. So we'll transition into that segment after Colton gives a thank you to one of our sponsors.
Absolutely. This next portion of our podcast, the interview portion, is going to be sponsored by the Montana Farm Bureau Federation. Montana Farm Bureau Federation is leading Montana agriculture toward a future with a prosperous ag economy and thriving rural communities. Become an advocate with Montana Farm Bureau Federation and help protect the future of Montana agriculture. You can learn more at mfbf.org.
Well, as you guys know, there's been a lot of updates to the grazing regulations for a lot of those public land users. It has certainly been a very key role for these producers to be involved with the regulatory process. And now with us on the phone, Kaitlynn Glover, the Executive Director of the Public Lands Council. And as you may know, she's originally from Wyoming, go Pokes. And Kaitlynn certainly has a diverse background in the agriculture policy and production, strong ties to the grazers, the recreationalists, and many other uses of public land resources. And Kaitlynn, appreciate you jumping on here at our Next Year Country podcast. But I think the first one we kind of got to dive off on is the update to the proposed grazing rule update. First time in, I think, 35 years that we're seeing an update there. I know you guys have been keeping a close eye on it because that public comment period's ending here, I think, in just a few days. July 13th is when that public comment period comes to a close. But what would you say are some of the biggest improvements that you guys are seeing in this proposal?
Well, when we look at the way the BLM has managed public lands grazing across those 155 million acres over the last 35 years, what we see is that the agency has simply failed to keep pace with some of the technology, with the science, with really all of the innovation that producers are putting on their own private ground. These producers are managing with a lot of knowledge about adaptive management, responding to the land, responding to natural resource conditions and things like that. And unfortunately, the agency, because it's been constrained by some pretty rigid regulations, hasn't been able to apply those same principles or allow producers to apply those same principles on their allotments. And so, this is the first time that the agency has gone through a regulatory revision process since 2006, when those regulations at that point were enjoined by the court. They never went into effect, and so we have never operated under those rules. So unfortunately for these producers, they've been operating under the same rules since 1995. And I think it's really important to sort of mark that milestone because it's not arbitrary, right? It's not just, that it's been 30 years and we need to make some innovation. But it's important to remember that those regulations were developed after a very public, very damaging and disparaging campaign against livestock grazing on federal land. For those of us who can remember, there was this sort of call to action by radical environmentalists and others to be cattle free by 93 and to remove that grazing from public lands, remove those producers from the land, take those lands out of production and return them to something else, right? And the regulations from 1995 reflect that sentiment. And so for producers who are looking at these BLM rules today, it is inherently a massive improvement because we recognize that the agency is not trying to be cattle free. They're in fact trying to make it so that grazing has a secure place on the landscape. And I think to your point, they're doing that through a variety of ways. One is just a slew of really important, maybe kind of boring from a procedural perspective, right? But really important administrative updates, how they bill, when they bill, what that looks like. But bigger things like, producers being able to mentor someone who isn't a son or daughter. It could be a niece or a nephew, or a granddaughter or a grandson, or even the hired man who's been on the place for a long time, who wants to be able to run cows and wants to be able to, have their own stake in that management for the first time in what a regulation would allow. So the regulations propose that sort of, they're calling it sort of the expanded mentee program, which is absolutely huge. We're also seeing just this general ethos of flexibility, right? That, the agency and the producer, the permittee can look at that ground and say, okay, I think this is what these conditions look like this year. We've done that range monitoring, we've done, all this work and we're looking for some flexibility in on and off dates. We're looking for some flexibility to use grazing as a tool to do something specific on the landscape, like, reduce the risk of wildfire, for example, and be able to do some of those things as well. There's some pretty, helpful language in range improvements. I think there's some really helpful language that recognizes that for the last 30 years, the posture of the agency has been that, if your AUMs, your annual unit months, are suspended, that basically until now, those have likely been consigned to the past, right? If you have AUMs that are suspended, they probably weren't coming back. Under these new regulations, suspended AUMs truly would be temporary. This is a temporary change in use to be evaluated at a later time down the road, which is in and of itself a massive improvement, both in management approach, but also in adherence to what Congress told the agency to do with respect to grazing a long time ago. I could go on and on and on and on because I think these regulations, it is truly a comprehensive procedural overhaul, right? So, we're hearing some opposition saying that this radically changes the way and, is going to increase grazing across the board. And this is just, the worst thing ever for federal lands. When in fact, this makes the program work the way it was intended to work. And I think we have the science that bears out that, if and when that results in more AUMs on the landscape, if and when that results in, new and emergent and young, mentee permittees who want to be engaged in that livestock business, that's huge news, right? So in their procedural updates, program updates that are going to have a huge people and range effect. And it's going to undoubtedly be for the better.
Kaitlynn Coulter here. Appreciate that update. There's so much involved in this, and you talk about, procedural changes, but they can be a big deal. The one I want you to highlight is the rangeland health standards. It's a fairly, minute change on paper maybe that's happening, but it's a big deal, and now those will apply to all multiple uses, not just grazing.
You are 100% right. And I think this is, without a doubt, the most important part of this regulatory update. In 1995, what we saw in the agency was it was an entirely new section on rangeland health standards and assessments. What that section, over the years, spent a lot of time with people who had a hand in writing that section. And, what they wanted to do from the agency perspective was be able to have a tool to assess conditions on a grazing allotment, and then you use that information as a management tool. But unfortunately, when you have some siloed process at the agency, it often turns into a weapon, right? It turns into a cudgel to remove grazing, and it did that in a couple different ways. For example, when you looked at grazing allotments and you would conduct a land health standards analysis, or you would go out and do monitoring on that allotment, because that language, because that requirement lived in the regulatory text under the grazing regulations, it was the grazing program that had to essentially be accountable for whatever the condition of that allotment was, and then put their arms around what it would take to address those impacts, what it would take to address any sort of surface disturbance that they found. I think on its face, that sounds reasonable, right? But what actually ended up happening was that the agency, because it was the grazing program, because they didn't have authority over some of these other multiple uses, the only thing that they could get their arms around to change on the landscape if an area had some disturbance and wasn't meeting its ecological standards was to change grazing. It didn't matter if that land had been burned out. It didn't matter if you had a massive, mountain bike race come through. It didn't matter if that had been part of a really heavy snow that turned into a landslide. It also didn't matter if the state and the feds weren't, agreeing on what a wildlife carrying capacity looked like, and you had a huge increase in grazing from some of the larger ruminants, right? We've seen some of those wildlife over time have some pretty significant impacts on allotments. And probably most pressing for a lot of your listeners and certainly a lot of my members, it also didn't allow the agency to account for impacts from horses and burros. The only thing that the agency could attribute that disturbance to, because they were doing the monitoring in a grazing allotment boundary, was the grazing activity. And so for the last 30 years, federal lands grazing permittees have borne the responsibility, the sole responsibility, for ensuring the rangeland health on their allotment, even though their allotment is subject to many, many other uses. That's the whole principle of multiple use, right? And so what these regulations do is say, okay, these assessments assessments are still important. It is important for the agency to conduct a meaningful analysis of what true rangeland conditions look like. Where we see, this larger analysis or this rangeland landscape scale analysis indicate that we might have some challenges. We're going to do a step down rapid analysis to be able to say, okay, we see that there's a problem. We're going to go in, we're going to diagnose it, and then we're going to take action. And I think that is the biggest difference from the 95 regs to now, is that you not only have a sense of urgency to address the root cause, but you also have an agency that's been given the authority to do what's called a causal factor analysis. You see a condition, you ask why, you figure out what is causing that issue. That's the causal factor analysis. And then you fix it, right? And I think that to a lot of us feels really, really common sense. But for the last 30 years hasn't been the MO of the agencies. They've not had the ability to do that. So I think when we look at these regs, we are seeing a massive investment in landscape health and a massive investment in process that inherently will alleviate burdens for a bunch of livestock permittees, but doesn't let them off the hook either for rangeland conditions. And so I think when we're looking at the true motivations of our grazing permittees who want to keep their lands healthy, who want to make sure that these allotments are as high quality and highly maintained as they can, this is a huge step forward in them being empowered to make the best decision for the land too.
Kaitlynn, I mentioned that the public grazing rule that we're talking about here, the comment period ending on Monday the 13th. Is there ways that your members can go to your website and find ways to easily make those comments? Or is there, a how-to form that they can easily make those comments before the deadline?
There absolutely is. So there are two ways that we have supported our members and have supported permittees. And frankly, even people who care about livestock grazing on the landscape, but might not be permittees themselves, right? We have hunting partners, we have recreation partners, we have conservation partners, all of whom say we want to see grazing on the landscape. How can we help and how can we support this effort? And so as part of that, people can go to our website, publiclandscouncil.org, and they'll see a place for them to go straight to the what's called the docket, where they can submit comments directly. But they also are going to see a link that allows them to go to sort of a fillable form that we've created that makes it a little bit easier to say, look, for example, my name is Kaitlynn Glover and I'm a permittee in this area. And this is the thing that I care about. We encourage people to customize those stories. We encourage people to tell their individual stories because that's what makes this effort so powerful. But there is, there's some suggested points in there that might prompt them and draw out some of those stories in a helpful way. So that's publiclandscouncil.org. They can also go to our Facebook page or to our Instagram page and find that same link there. We really want to make sure that people have the resources they need to engage in this process.
As mentioned, you can have multiple options to fill out those details at publiclandscouncil.org. Appreciate that, Kaitlynn. But of course, another one that is a big win, in my opinion, is the BLM rescinding the public lands rule. Of course, this was a rule brought forward by the Biden administration that wanted to try and put conservation on the same level as grazing. It's kind of tough not to crack a cold one over this one because it seems like a pretty big win because you guys were advocating, when that was first announced by the Biden administration, that this is not good for public land grazers.
There's a lot to celebrate with the rollback of this rule. And I don't think that there's any question. When this rule came out in its proposed form, PLC is sort of said, well, wait a minute, this is not within the purview of the agency. They don't have the authority to do this. And also, by the way, it's a really bad idea for them to create an entirely new leasing system on federal lands without congressional intent and to do it in a way that would give future agencies the ability to push grazing off the landscape. And I think that's important to remember because, anytime you go through this regulatory process, it's not just this administration that's going to implement the rule. It's everyone after that. And so when you have that kind of uncertainty going into a rule that's not directed by Congress, that could be just so bad for not only for permittees, but for multiple use generally, man, we celebrated in a big way to see that rule rolled back. And I find it's really important that we continue to remind folks, grazing permittees permittees, livestock producers are the people who are investing in conservation at scale. They are the ones who are making investments in riparian areas, in wildlife habitat, in water infrastructure, in forest health. And so, it is absolutely not that these permittees were concerned that, institutionally they had concerns with conservation. It's that when the last administration tried to turn conservation into a new money-making tool at the expense of all of the other uses on the landscape, that's when everybody sort of got their backs up a bit. And I think not only did this administration listen and see those concerns, but we had a lot of support from a lot of other places as well, demonstrating that this rule was just not the right way to encourage conservation on the landscape. But I would argue that, when we look at these grazing regulations, when we look at making sure that ranchers can do what they need to do on the landscape, that's the way we have lasting health and sustainability on these landscapes. So, man, has it been a good month?
It sure has. Colton Young here, Kaitlynn. And I guess one of the big things that I took out of this from the rescinding of the public lands rule was the quote, multiple use lands. And I think there's been a lot of misconceptions since this did come out. And, we've seen a lot of environmental groups, other groups, recreational, public land users, all kind of express their concerns. And I'm sure you've read about every single one of those as well. But what does multiple use mean to you? And how does rescinding this rule also advocate for the fact that it's the same playing field? We're not seeing public land grazing just take over all of the public lands. There is still plenty of area, plenty of use, and they can kind of work together from the recreationalists, the hunters, other public land users. It's all working together. And that's kind of what rescinding this rule is all about.
I really couldn't say it better myself. I think that's exactly it, right? And, without going too far down the historical rabbit hole, right? Part of the reason that the Federal Land Policy and Management Act, the law that the BLM uses to manage this multiple use landscape, really, the reason that was enacted in the late 70s was because we had a lot of these rules that were sort of standalone, the Mineral Leasing Act, the Mining Act, the Taylor Grazing Act. And at that time, and I think to be fair, grazing permittees weren't super excited about FLPMA because they were worried about how the agency would effectively manage multiple use. Multiple use is the concept of having multiple uses, these multiple valuations, things that create value for the American people in a variety of different ways, having them all on the landscape in some form or fashion. And it's not every use in every place at every time at every level, but it is a comprehensive analysis and a direction for the agency to look at a piece of land, to look at what the public needs, to look at what the community needs, to look at what the land needs in order to be effective and productive, and then make a decision about, at what level do these activities make sense. And so when you looked at something like the conservation rule, what it was saying was not that, we love conservation and we want to see more conservation on the landscape. Because if that was the case, you would have had ranchers across the U.S. saying, yep, we agree, we're all in, tell us where we sign up. That rule instead created this expectation that there could be an arbitrary and sort of moving target for what conservation would look like. And that if somebody wanted to, and I'm saying this in air quotes, right, do conservation on the landscape, that they would have the ability to kick other uses off the land. And that in and of itself is contrary to the tenet of multiple use. You don't turn an area into a single use. You don't convert it from multiple use to a single use because one use has, primacy. Certainly not without the direction of Congress, right? And so I think when we look at the future of public lands, when we look at the future of the way the BLM is going to manage these landscapes, because we were successful as an industry and as a community in pushing back against this entirely new leasing system, what you're going to see is a much more collaborative approach to, how do we ensure conservation happens, right? Because conserving land happens through a wide variety of ways, right? It's the byproduct of how we manage lands. But how do we do that together and in a way that we're not, kicking somebody else off or elbowing somebody else out of the way? And I think that's really what public land management should look like. That's certainly the way grazing manages. Grazing grazing manages for a lot of different values and a lot of different benefits. And so as we look to the way this agency now is approaching multiple use, is approaching using grazing as a conservation tool, we are going to see a much more successful outcome, I guess, because we don't have this sort of albatross of the public lands rule hanging over the neck of anybody who wants to have security in accessing their federal lands. And I think that's sort of the long and short of it, right, is that we have a huge commitment to conservation in and among grazing permittees. There is a massive investment and a massive recognition that what they do on their allotment needs to ensure that that allotment is going to be healthy for the future. And what we do today impacts forage and water tomorrow. And so what we do today better be right and it better be helpful.
Kaitlynn, one thing that we may have skipped over is the fact that there's a big hats off to you and the Public Lands Council. You know, you guys have been there on the front lines defending those public land grazers. So we really do appreciate that and appreciate what you do for those public land grazers. One other hat tip that we have to give this year as well is it's the International Year of the Rangeland and Pastoralist. It's a great recognition opportunity. It was actually brought about from the United Nations designating this as the International Year of the Rangeland and Pastoralist. Kaitlynn, if there was just one message that you'd like to get out to the general public to take away from the international recognition of this, what would you say that would be?
You know, 2026 is all about celebrating farmers and ranchers around the world, the people who are sheep herders I'm sitting in Utah right now. So the sheep herders in Utah and the people who, raise goats in Ghana and the people who are managing yaks in Mongolia. It really is pretty incredible, the community around the world that we've seen come together this year to not draw divisions and say that, one place is doing agriculture, doing livestock production the right way, but really come to celebrate the people and the cultures and the traditions, the commitment to family and the commitment to the land that generally livestock producers share. So the International Year of Rangelands and Pastoralists, this conversation started a number of years ago, more than a decade ago, with farmers saying, hey, guys, we see all of these honors being, bestowed upon and recognition being bestowed on a lot of other industries. But remember, most of us have, we're in FFA ourselves or have kids or grandkids in FFA, but without agriculture, we'd all be hungry, naked, and homeless, right? And that's true around the world. And so this International Year of Rangelands and Pastoralists celebrates the people who produce that food and fiber, who keep these lands intact, who protect them from conversion and development and desertification and land loss and things like that, from fire, from all of these threats, and really are able to celebrate them. Here in the U.S., pastoralism is alive and well. These are the people who are they have bands of sheep that they manage and, herders that sit with them in the summer. They're the people who rotate cows in their pastures to make sure that they are making optimal use of their forage. It looks a little bit different maybe than it did 100 or 150 years ago or 200 years ago, but it is a tradition of family, of dedication, of really making a living off the land and having a respect for the land and working with the land to make all of it possible. So we're super excited. I'm here in Utah actually right now. I have the privilege of being able to host folks from around the West, across the U.S., but also some friends from the international community who are helping us to celebrate the year as part of the North American Grazing Lands Congress. PLC is co-hosting that event with the U.S. Roundtable for Sustainable Beef, and we were just in Canada earlier this week to work with the Canadian Cattlemen's Association for their leg of the tour to really be able to highlight for us the way, public lands ranchers, the way livestock producers here in the U.S. are really just sort of setting the gold standard. So very excited for the year. If folks want more information, there are plenty of resources available. Again, visit our website or follow us on social media and we can get you plugged into some events coming up, because this is an event that's going to continue well beyond December 31st, since again, farming and ranching, and especially the way we do it here in the U.S., is sort of the crux of these rural communities.
All right, Kaitlynn, one last question. It's a global perspective one again, but I know you are big into soccer. Hate to see what happened on Monday with the U.S. and Belgium game, but what's your prediction for the FIFA World Cup? champion?
Look, this is going to get me in a lot of trouble here. But I was so sad to see our men's team fall. But I think what we've watched this year, and especially this year, seeing people in the U.S. become fans for the first time and really being able to engage really makes me excited for the potential that we have to capture that same level of attention and capture that same level of like novelty and energy for agriculture, because some people just aren't fans because they don't know. And so that's what we try to do every day. As we look ahead, I'm not sure if my husband's going to hear this, but hopefully I get brownie points if I do this. My family is a huge fan of French soccer, and so I've probably gotta say that France is looking pretty strong. But it's been a really neat thing to be able to see people in the U.S. come together around something that is so global, and it's really, really cool to see the interaction between the World Cup and FIFA and the work that we're doing with the International Year of Rangelands and Pastoralists too, because of course, where there are rangelands, where there are open spaces, there are people who want to have a little bit of a break, and a lot of people around the world take a break by playing soccer.
I will admit it has turned this hockey fan into a one-game soccer fan. I did watch the entire U.S. game, so that is saying something. That is saying something. Kaitlynn, appreciate your time today, and good luck this week in Utah.
Well, thank you so much, and appreciate all that you do to share information and to make sure that people have the resources that they need.
Well, thanks a bunch, Kaitlynn. Appreciate you squeezing us into your busy schedule. Now we're going to transition into our markets, where there's been a heck of a lot going on here, but want to thank our sponsor, Western Ranch Supply. They're Montana-owned and operated, proudly serving farmers and ranchers with quality products and trusted expertise for over 70 years. They're trusted by generations because they're built by generations. So, Colton, we're going to turn to you to start on these markets here. I don't know where you want to start, grains or cattle. There's been a lot going on here in the last week.
There's been a lot, and I'm going to need you to put your speculating hat on here for a minute, because it could get a little Western here. But there's been a lot of movement here in the past 2 weeks, and I'm going to start with the cattle markets just to keep it up to par with what we've been doing. But if you look at what the feeder cattle contracts, I think we were a little easier today, still softer moves on the market, but we've dropped over $17 since the 20th of June. It has, that seems like yesterday. And so we're officially in the dog days of summer now that we're behind the from Memorial Day to the 4th of July, that kind of holiday rush and the peak grilling season and demand. Of course, we will see the seasonal decline, but it will pick back up as we approach Labor Day in September. But we have seen the choice cutouts and the box beef prices. They've dropped over $15 as well. Just last week, at the early part of the week, we were at $4. Now we're down to $3.82 was the last I looked at it. So, that's almost a $20 drop. We're also seeing some softer moves in the cash market as well. So it's just providing a little uncertainty. Now, big picture, we are still very well supported. Feeder cattle and superior livestock sale this week. We can dive into some of those results, but very impressive demand. But curious on your thoughts, the dog days of summer. What does this really mean for the overall state of the market? And have we actually reached the peak that everyone keeps asking that same question?
Boy, I don't know if we found the peak or not. I think there's just too much road in front of us to be able to say the peak in this cycle is in. I think we're going to be hard pressed to get back to wherever that top was, somewhere around 380 in feeder cattle. But I don't think there's big concern here. I think that the trade has largely liquidated some of that long position. But really, this is a seasonal move, not unexpected to see, especially here post 4th of July. Beef demand does typically slide back. And still, what'd you say on that choice cutout? 385?
Yeah, we're still 382 to 85. And they're
still a very strong price. I thought 390 was kind of a short-term support level. So I think, yeah, it is sliding back. Beef demand probably will go down, especially in the heat of summer. Cash-fed cattle and the live cattle futures, I would kind of expect them to pull back. And, it's interesting. You pull back to this time a year ago, screwworm was all over the news because we had just shut the border again to Mexico. Yep. And that was new news at that time, that we're not going to be letting any Mexican cattle in here. That's stale news at this point. We're still not bringing those cattle in, but it's not causing that huge bullish wave that we saw the entire cattle market ride last year. So I think long term, you have to focus on the fundamentals. We're still looking at tight supplies. We're still looking at strong beef demand. And really at this point, I think the market is looking for a bullish factor to trade on. I don't think we're going to see traders and other market participants really push this thing higher without an excuse to do so. The next excuse, though, might be the cattle inventory report coming up here in what, just about a week?
Yeah, right about a week. But yeah, and you know what's interesting to me too is the basis between the live cattle and the live cattle futures and the negotiated sales. There's about a maybe $15 difference between the two. You know, the negotiated cash cow is about $15 higher than what we're seeing on the futures, on the nearby futures. So that to me is a little bit interesting, and hopefully will provide an opportunity for these cattle futures traders to be like, oh, well, look where the cash basis is right now. This is what they're getting. So hopefully, we'll give that. Did you guys see that USDA release come out today? They're looking for comments on the beef grading standards, the beef grade standards. They're talking about maybe switching. They want to just gather comments right now. It sounds like to see what everybody thinks about these beef grade standards right now. And I think they're kind of seeing the fact that there's so few select cuts, and there's is there so many prime cuts. Do we need to increase the marbling perspective? I don't know. I haven't got to read the full details, what they need from them. But coming out just today, the USDA is looking for comments on the beef grade standards.
That's really interesting. We'll have to definitely follow up on that for sure. But like you mentioned, Coulter, if we do decline that seasonal, we're still sitting very well compared to what we've been at in the past. I think they're calling in the latest cattle facts report is to see the choice cutouts in the box beef prices around mid to late August hold a somewhat of a foundation around $370. So it's only another $12 from where we're at right now. Not the end of the world by any means. And then for the live bids, I think I did see they were asking for about $248 were some of the asking prices early this week. They are expecting to see mid 240s as we fall into that late July, heading into August, and even into September, the high 240s. So not a steep drop by any means in the next few months expected, but there's definitely a lot of optimism as Superior Livestock is hosting their week in the Rockies as we speak. Still a few more days to go here this week, but some of the highlights from our region of cattle, some light 8-weight steers for fall delivery out of both Montana and Wyoming. They came in at $389. Heavy 8-weights out of the HD Ranch in Wyoming at $401. $4 a pound for some 8-weight steers. Light 9s, they averaged around $365, with heavy 9-weight steers for fall at $358. Some light 5-weights the other day out of Wyoming, $555 to $562. And those heifer mates only about $15 off from $530 to $535.
So that sounds close to steady to what we saw last month on the calves.
Yep.
I think that those yearlings might be a touch stronger even. I know we see more yearlings sell in the summer, but we also sold a lot of those yearlings early like we've talked about, so maybe a little more support there.
Yeah, I don't know if I saw some 8-weights at the $4 mark. I know they were close. They were very, very close, and then like you said, some of the other calves, pretty steady, maybe $1 or $2 higher as well on those averages. But another point to wanted to talk about here as we kind of transition to the grain, still in between the grain and cattle, but some of the hay prices as we're getting into cutting season. Of course, throughout this last weekend, I did see a bunch of guys already have some bales out in the field. They'll be making some decent headway here. The latest USDA report for the Montana region did show some hay being delivered into western Montana, mostly coming from Washington, eastern and central Montana from the Dakotas at $225 to $250 a ton, depending on the freight.
That'll be an interesting one to watch with as much moisture as shown up in a lot of parts of Montana in June and even early part of July here. We may get a little more hay cut than we thought we were going to, but boy, I think there's a lot of dry areas. I would be concerned this hay market's going to move higher still.
I agree, but you look at the USDA comments on the Wyoming hay report anyways, they said that the quality was up, actually. The quality was up is what they were being reported. Volume down, that's kind of one of the helpful drivers to the prices anyways. Of course, one of the big reasons that volume's down is irrigation supplies across Wyoming anyways are short due to the lack of moisture. And yeah, you mentioned some of those prices, Colton, but what I see in Wyoming, we saw $400 ton hay on the premium side, or maybe on the cube side anyways, but
yeah, just throwing some feelers out there.
250, 255 on
Yeah.
some of the large squares. But yeah.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if we see that hold pretty steady. Like you said, the quality is definitely there. The yields are down pretty good this year. I know a lot of guys were a little disappointed in their first cutting, but they cut it about a week early in hopes of trying to get somewhat of a moderate second cutting as well. So definitely keep an eye on that. But I think the real big news this last week, and really as we head into getting close to harvest season, it's going to be the June acreage report. We will see a World Ag Supply and Demand Estimates report at the end of this week as well. But that acreage report did show all wheat acres in the U.S. down 6%. Montana winter wheat was total wheat 4.9 million acres planted. North Dakota at 5.5. South Dakota at just over 1 million. Did see a pretty significant drop all across the board, anywhere from 4 to 6%, and all wheat acres dropped for the year.
And to me, that wasn't shocking to see that level. I think it did surprise the trade a little bit, particularly because USDA puts their first round of expectations out in March, and we kind of think winter wheat's it's pretty well in by March, right? But
Yeah.
it's a pretty significant revision lower on that. So I think that did surprise the trade. To me, the real number here is the abandonment level, where they said, let me pull the number up, 31 million acres of winter wheat seeded, but only 21 million going to be harvested. I think that's a lot more than normal. And of course, most of that's in the southern plains where there's millions of acres that aren't going to be harvested. Heck, Andy Schwab said he saw custom cutters driving by the other day. So they have moved north quickly this year.
Yeah, I've already heard of them on the High Line, and like you said, saw them right outside the front office. Another figure that I put a highlight mark to on that wheat numbers was Durham. Durham's down 16%.
Yeah.
But one that was at a record high, canola, 2.9 million acres of canola, a record amount of canola. So kind of I think you can point to the fact that some producers are saying, hey, well, I'll try a new crop this year. Wheat's not the price that we need it to be. Let's try something that else is out there. But sounds like a lot of them did it because it's a record amount at 2.9 million acres.
Yeah, well, I know they're already, I think the Monday's crop progress and conditions report said that winter wheat is already 60% harvested right after the 4th of July. That's got to be well ahead of what the average. I would guess the average is probably 30 to 40 maybe. And like you said, they're already moving up north. Another interesting one that I thought was barley acres up to 860,000 acres, up from 780 from last year in Montana. So, and then corn and soybeans, they were pretty much on par with what we were expecting to see. Corn was down 3%, but still the 4th highest planted acreage in the U.S. since 1944. Most of those acres did roll right over to soybeans as they were up 5%.
Well, and another key crop in Montana, North Dakota, of course, is our pulse crops. And unsurprising there, I think, to see a significant pullback in acreage. I mean, when we're talking these pulse prices that are anywhere from 10 to 20%, 40% lower than where they were a year ago when you talk about lentils. So we did see a big reduction there. I think lentil acreage is down 30%, and then your dry peas and chickpeas are down 10 to 12%. So the market wasn't there. I think pulses still represent an important agronomic part of our crop rotations, and so guys are leaving them in, but certainly not going to them like they did last year. And Andy, you mentioned the canola. I know there was a 500,000 increase in canola acres in just North Dakota, but if you look at more of the specialty type crops, those are all increasing. We planted more oats this year, more safflower, more flaxseed. So I mean, those are relatively small amount of acres compared to the corn and wheat, but guys are trying to find something that'll make a little money. I mean, we still see a little bit more mustard every year. So something that largely grown on a contract, I think, to try to have some certainty in what that's going to bring. But guys are looking for the options of what they can do, and hopefully something that maybe doesn't take as much inputs, especially this year.
Yep, and of course you can always find these prices, these stories, and much more on our website, northernag.net. Looking forward to next week. It's going to be an interesting one. We're getting ready for the following week, really. It's going to be a busy week, not necessarily next week, but the following week, because we have our For the Farmers tour coming up. We got a couple of stops in the Golden Triangle, and we're going to send Colton and Coulter on the road here in a couple of weeks. I'm going to stay home, and I'm going to eat a dang good steak at the Northern Livestock Video Auction Summertime Classic. That's also is mentioned in a couple of weeks, but next week, it seems like we might have the Hollenbecks coming in.
Yep, that's the plan. We'll have Henry and Sarah Hollenbeck. Of course, their big plan to put in a sheep feedlot in Molt, Montana. Did see a little bit of pushback from the county commissioners, but just last week, right before the 4th, did get approval for that. So excited to have them join, talk about their plans. And, you know, we talk about a sheep feedlot in Molt, Montana. It doesn't sound very big, but they're talking about a potential $7 million impact to the state's economy. That could be huge for the entire state. So
that's a big deal for Stillwater County.
Absolutely. Yeah. Looking forward to having them on.
Well, and Andy, you mentioned the For the Farmers tour. So that'll be July 21st and 23rd. We'll be in Great Falls on Tuesday, Conrad on Thursday. And if you happen to be in Great Falls Tuesday evening, we'll be recording the Next Year podcast live from the Sip and Dip Lounge. So a chance to come in and see what it's like. We'll just have to see if we can get the mermaids in there. Colton and I are hoping that we can record from Piano Pat's little section there. I don't know. We haven't got full approval to do it.
That's sacred ground.
Right?
You can't touch that. That is true. Well, for Colton Young and for Colton Brown, I'm Andy Schwab. Next Year Country Podcast with Northern Ag Network.